Folks trickling in, come on in, don't be shy. Welcome everyone to our third Coffee and Conversation of the season. Welcome back to those of you who come week after week. It's a wonderful group that we see every week coming back. So next week we will be on Coffee and Conversation hiatus because we will be in the Summer Institute. So this lovely poster gives you the information you need to participate next week. And in fact, right about now, Secretary of State of Michigan will be taking the stage, Jocelyn Benson with Joanna Lidgate. They're going to do a session called States, the Front Lines of Democracy. Don't we know it? And it should be wonderful. So we will return to Coffee and Conversation the following week, August 6th. So just so everyone sort of knows the plan. So I have to say, just as a little bit of a welcome, it was late November, and we were at the office down in Turrets where all of our offices are. And within maybe like 15 minutes, there were like 3 emails that like dashed around our office, and they were all like, did you guys see Morgan made the Forbes under 30 for media list, you know? And so it was like we had our own like internal woot woot kind of moment with that news, which was really cool. And we can't claim Morgan as an alum, but we kind of can claim her as family because she is Lynn Bolger's daughter, my predecessor Lynn, who was here and doing this job that I get to do for 13 years. And so, Morgan, we know that you know this place, and we know you probably know every like nook and cranny too, because when you're a kid growing up around COA, you get yourself into everything. Anyway, we're thrilled to have you, and we were like, oh, we've got to get her back to campus. So we were on it, and I'm so glad that you're here. And to lead our conversation as our interlocutor this morning is none other than Beth Gardiner, our chair of the Board of Trustees. Thank you for doing this, Beth. And Beth's got her own background in media that goes back to NBC, so there's deep credibility there in terms of the subject matter. These days, however, when she's not sort of steering our ship through all the waters that we navigate, including presidential transitions and small things like that, Beth is an art historian. She does a bunch of stuff that's over my head. I believe that she focuses on Asian art, maybe the 16th and 17th century, something like that. So, I mean, we couldn't say enough about Beth and her leadership here. So we've got an awesome pair, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I'll leave it there. I'll turn it to you, Beth, and thanks for being here. Oh, and I'll just say, we'll go for like 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. And we do have an online audience at each of these, so we just ask people to speak into the mic like that and do a better job than I am. All right, thanks.
Perfect. Great.
Welcome, everybody. I wanted to begin by saying fortune favors the brave. Thank you to everybody who found their way through the rain, the wet, damp Maine morning. I had the pleasure of pre-interviewing Morgan earlier this week, and we spent an hour on the phone, and she completely lit up my entire day. So I'm going to tell you that a damp Maine day doesn't hold a chance against Morgan.
Oh.
Morgan Lavoie is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Money News Network. It's a podcast company that creates and produces podcasts surrounding financial literacy with the goal of closing the wealth gap for women and people of color. Not only did she, before she even turned 30 years of age, conceive and launch a podcast enterprise, but Morgan and her business partner, Nicole Lappin, have carved out a big space in a crowded podcast world. Their podcast network has 7 shows, all within the financial literacy space, thank you, speak louder, including the daily show, Money Rehab with Nicole Lappin, which is often one of Apple Podcasts' #1. Money News Network has won Webby Awards for their shows, and they have 6.2 million followers across their platforms. What I want to learn about today from Morgan is about how she and her partner very deliberately found their way into this space and are dominating it. You don't have to take just my word for how well respected Morgan is in the field of media. This year, as Sean said, she was nominated and won a place on the coveted Forbes 30 Under 30 in the media category. It's a list of the youngest and most impressive movers and shakers in the media business. Morgan's story of how she arrived here isn't a straight trajectory. It's fascinating, so hold on and explore it as we explore it with her. I wanted to start by sharing that Morgan grew up in Blue Hill. She went to MDI High School, and she has a strong COA link, which Sean brought up. Her wonderful mother, Lynn Bolger, was our former head of advancement for many years, more than a decade at COA, and she really helped propel us into this fantastic, successful place that the college is now. In addition, Lynn also dreamt up and launched this very series, Coffee and Conversation, and this has become so much part of the fabric of our summers in MDI. So welcome, Morgan.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. What a kind introduction. And it's amazing to be on campus. I've never been in this building before. It's so beautiful. And so great to be with all of you this morning.
I'm going to claim that Morgan is one of our homegrown talents. And I want to start at the beginning because that's how I learned about Morgan. And I think it really kind of brings to light who she is as a person and what she's achieved and what's happening in the world of podcasts these days. So first of all, let's go back to the beginning and tell me a little bit about growing up in this area and how it influenced you.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone has any issues hearing me, just shout it out and I can be a little bit louder. So just let me know. But as you mentioned, my mom worked here for what felt like a million years to me. And so I remember sitting on the floor for office and turrets and reading and coloring, and COA was really the first college campus that I spent a lot of time on when I was 12, 13, I think is when around the time where my mom started here. And so from the jump, COA set a very high bar for what a college should look like and really shaped the way that I did my own college tours later on. But Maine is just such a special place. I went to a Waldorf school where we didn't have any grades or any type of homework or assessment of any kind. You really just learn how to love learning for the sake of learning. And that was so important to me as I decided what I wanted to do. I knew that exploring and pursuing curiosity was always going to be a cornerstone of it. And I think it's really because of the community that I grew up in.
And you ended up going to Skidmore College.
I did.
And you'll be very surprised to hear this. This is one of the facts that was hidden away that I didn't realize. You actually started out as a scientist.
Yeah.
And a neuroscientist. So tell us a little bit about that college and how you dove into the sciences.
Yeah, I studied, my degree is in neuroscience, and I think the reason why I chose that path was because of the curiosity that I was talking about before. I loved asking big questions, and neuroscience and figuring out how the brain worked just seemed to be the best kind and the most interesting types of questions that you could ask. And when I graduated, so I don't work in science now, I work in podcasting. And the way that I made that turn was I graduated from Skidmore and I moved to New York, and I thought that I was going to wear a white lab coat every day and work in a lab. And the first job that I was offered was in a lab where I would have to do cranial surgeries on monkeys. And I just thought, I can't do that. I'm so not cut out for that. And so I really had to take a beat and think about what I actually liked about science and what I wanted to do next. And I thought back about what I liked the most about my time in college, and I really loved being a tutor. And I liked most meeting with students who did not want to take any sort of science classes. I loved working with the students who had to take a science class in order to graduate and really didn't want to be there, and trying to find a way to make them interested in what they were learning about and try to tell an interesting story about their assignment so that they were engaged and they wanted to do a good job with it. And I had always been a big science podcast nerd. I loved Radio Lab and Invisibilia and all of these science podcasts that did such a great job at doing exactly that, taking a really academic topic and making it accessible to someone outside of a lab. And so that's how I started to think, okay, maybe I don't want to do cranial surgeries on monkeys, but instead I'd like to talk to people about science topics in a podcast format. And so I started to pursue that field, and that's how I ended up at iHeartRadio.
And there's a very fun part of the story because she ended up finding a job in podcasts by way of a chocolate factory. So I wanted her just to share with you about how the chocolate factory enters into this, because as I said, her trajectory is not linear. So just tell us a brief bit about that.
Yeah, and it's actually another COA connection. When I was at Skidmore, one of my best friends, Johnny Palker, after our first year at Skidmore, he just felt like that school was not the best fit for him, and he was describing the type of school experience that he wanted. And I thought I might be biased, but COA feels like the right fit for him. And so he ended up transferring to COA and graduating from COA. And then when I moved to New York, he's from Manhattan. And while I was job hunting, I needed to make money. And so I asked Johnny if he knew of anyone who would hire me. And his mom ran a chocolate shop in Harlem where it was a chocolate kitchen. We made our own chocolate there. And so we joked that we sort of traded moms, because he came to COA and he spent a lot of time in my mom's office. And then I went to New York, and then I worked with his mom in her chocolate kitchen. And so that was the way that I paid. So I did the very stereotypical thing, which I sold my car to move to New York with one suitcase. But then, that car rent money ran up very quickly. And so I needed to find a job. And so that's how the chocolate shop kind of gave me the runway to keep job hunting and find the job at iHeart.
So you ended up through a temporary job at iHeartMedia. So tell us a little bit about iHeartMedia. And I mean, so as Sean said, that I used to, which is true, I used to work for a decade at NBC News. The whole media landscape has totally changed from the time that I was young, with Morgan's age and working in it. So I'm personally fascinated by this. So iHeartMedia obviously didn't exist when I worked in media. So tell us, you started as a temp, and then tell us a little bit about your personal experience, and also about what iHeartMedia does for people who know or don't know.
Yeah, I started as a temp. I started as a temp, an assistant to the assistant of the president. And then when that assistant left, it sort of aligned with the time that my temp placement was ending. And so the president was like, so are we doing this? And I was like, is that a job offer? I'm new to this whole thing, but sounds like one. And so I ended up working as his assistant. He oversaw the whole entertainment slate at iHeart. And so iHeart was making this really interesting transition at the time, where it was mostly in terrestrial radio. So iHeart still has over 850 radio stations that you can listen to. But they were really interested in the digital and podcast space. So as a podcast nerd, it was a really great time to be there, because they were really investing in the podcast space and figuring out what kind of stories that they wanted to tell and how they wanted to do it. But for my first couple of years there, I worked on the live events team. So iHeart does a concert series called Jingle Ball at Madison Square Garden, and they do a music festival in Las Vegas with performers like Taylor Swift and Beyonce and all of the big pop names in pop. And so I did that for 2 years before just kind of relentlessly talking to anyone in the podcast department who would speak with me, and then eventually getting a job with them.
And tell us about iHeartMedia. What do they do, and what did you specifically do? Because you were involved in some really interesting podcasts, right? For very famous people that we all know.
Yeah, when I moved over to the podcast team, I was working as a producer, and so I worked on shows like I produced Bill Clinton's podcast, and I produced the actress Minnie Driver's podcast. I also worked on some narrative shows, like a couple of true crime podcasts, but mostly in the sort of thought leader chat space. And as a producer, I did everything from booking guests to scripting some of the intros and outros of the episodes, to doing the physical editing within the episodes themselves, really everything from pitch to publication. And iHeart does a whole range of different types of shows. They do the celebrity chat show format, but they also tackle really interesting true crime cases. And they have done a really great job at figuring out the right stories that should be told right now, and making sure that they're finding ways to pass the mic to the people who can tell those stories.
What's the hardest thing about putting together a podcast? Because I know these things are so intricate, and every part of it, there's a lot of different pieces that you have to put together if you're a producer, from landing the interview, conceiving the idea, and what is, can you break it down for us? Because I think people would be interested to hear how it works, and what are the sticking points? What's the hardest part of it?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is not my real answer, but we had this interesting transition during COVID where we used to record everything in a studio. And then in the first months of COVID, when we realized that, we weren't going anywhere for a while, we needed to figure out how to do all of our production remotely. And I was working on a show called Call Your Grandmother, which was hosted by two 90-year-old women. And so figuring out how to get them to record over Zoom and how to get them to plug their mics in was that just, no matter who you are, the logistics of, like, someone will always forget to unmute themselves on Zoom. It doesn't matter how old you are. Like, there are those sort of tech difficulties during COVID that I think can be a sort of funny sticking point. But I think the bigger question is, I think, always in the podcast space, if you're working with a host and they're interviewing someone about an important or personal topic, I think the sticking point is always bias and figuring out the best way to come up with interview questions that aren't, the sort of the way that people think about the old adage, like, not do unto others how you wish to be treated, but how you think they want to be treated, and sort of encapsulating that in an interview. Like, what are the types of questions that the person that you're talking to, what do they want to be asked? I think that is sort of the bigger sticking point that I know that at iHeart I run into now, and just making sure that we cover our blind spots the best we can.
Okay, we're going to dive into that because there was a lot there to follow up on. We're going to follow up on that later when we get into exactly the network that you started, and this idea of what your specific goal is with financial literacy for women and things. So I think there's a lot there. Just continuing with iHeart. The iHeart, it seems to me like iHeart started, it was like an explosion, and I mean, I really feel that. I live in London, and I feel like we were late to the game. Maybe I personally was late to the game, but like it all of a sudden, like, it was like a storm, and they came out of nowhere. And so, but it seems to me like iHeart was well positioned, like they saw that coming, and you happened to be, in there right when it happened. So tell us a little bit about just the philosophy of iHeart and how that happened, how they captured what was happening in the broader landscape.
Well, the leadership at iHeart is really interesting. My boss at the time and the CEO of the company, they both co-founded MTV together. And so they were, 25 when they did that. They're in their 60s now, but they have a really compelling and proven background in finding ways to revolutionize media and really kind of keep their finger on the pulse of where the trends are going. And so it was interesting because with MTV, they took radio and put it on television, and at iHeart, I feel like they really put radio and put it on podcasts. And so radio was something that they knew how to do really well, but they saw that people wanted to consume a radio format more on demand, and they wanted to binge their favorite show in a way that, listening every morning at X time wasn't really supporting. And so I think that they just had that culture of always kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. And they always talked about, 850 radio stations. It's a really large company, but they talk about how they feel like they're still a startup, and they're always innovating, and they're always thinking about doing new things. And so I think that they were in the right place in the right time with the podcast space, but I think they're also just willing to be in the wrong place at the wrong time too. And because of that willingness, they end up making good decisions and just staying nimble and being able to jump on opportunities as soon as they feel like they're happening.
So somehow in that culture, you and Nicole
Mhm.
decided that you were brave enough to spin off and found your own Money News network. So how does that happen? Like who came up with the idea? Who approached who? How did you do it? Who did you get to back you? Give us a little bit of idea about how that all coalesced.
Yeah. So my co-founder, Nicole Lappin, is this very cool, it, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear, but she's a badass. She was the youngest anchor to ever be a financial reporter on CNBC. And your background's at NBC too. And she started reporting on the floor of the Chicago Merc when she was 18. She has this very impressive background in financial reporting specifically. But she's first generation American, and her parents taught her that the best place to keep your money is in the bathroom under your sink. And as she grew older, she realized that there was actually perhaps a better place to keep her money than under the sink. And so she graduated in 2008. It was a really tumultuous financial time, and so she really felt like it was important to teach people about the risky things that can happen with their money, but also the rewarding things that they can do with their money and how to spot the difference between the two. And I feel like I had a similar moment because we started her podcast, Money Rehab, in 2021. And we knew we wanted to do a daily financial show. And we opened it up to just see what topics people were most interested in learning about personal finance at the time. And a lot of them were around COVID-related financial hardships, like I got laid off, what do I do now? Or if I'm furloughed, do I qualify for unemployment? Or I got a stimulus check, what's the best way for me to use that? And so I was really struck by, I was working with Bill Clinton and Minnie Driver and all of these really well-known and respected thought leaders, but we didn't have a response. None of the shows that I was working on had a response quite like Money Rehab, because money is so personal, and it's changing now, but historically we haven't been taught financial literacy in school. And so we got a lot of response from people who were listening to the show who would say things like, I watched my house get foreclosed on when I was growing up, and I was worried that the apple wouldn't fall far from the tree, and I would be doomed to repeat the same patterns because I didn't learn how to do anything different in school. And knowing, having this resource, having this podcast that I can listen to and learn how to choose a different path for myself is really empowering. And so we felt like we could do more than one show. And so we talked together about taking this one podcast from iHeart and using it as the marquee show to build out more financial resources that go beyond personal financing and finance and focus on investing specifically or starting your own business specifically, and then addressing some of the blind spots that we have. So we have a show that's in English and in Spanish, who's hosted by a woman who left Cuba with her family when the financial system was collapsing there. And her approach to finance is very different because there's a lot of trauma there around putting your money into a financial institution that then crumbled in Cuba, and then coming to the United States and learning a new financial system and learning to trust that financial system. And so just knowing that there was more that we could do made us really excited to start the network.
It's interesting too, because I know, if you correct me if I'm wrong, but I know obviously the focus of the network is financial literacy, specifically focused on women, and also new Americans, people new to this country, people of color. I was saying to Morgan, I know she's one of those things.
Mm-hmm.
She's a woman, so that, but the other two you aren't. So I think that's an interesting thing to. How do you handle that? How do you think about it at the network? And you personally also, what's the importance of it to you?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And it's something that we've had to grapple with, because the reason why we wanted to focus on women and people of color and new Americans is because, especially after COVID, there was a lot of interesting and hard research that came out around the wealth gaps and opportunity gaps. And those are the people that traditionally do have more economic hardship. And so if we wanted to create resources that were to reach the people who needed it the most, these were the communities that we needed to reach. But to your point, I am one of those three things. And so I'll start with the sort of subject of women. And the pattern that I've seen in really digging into this research is that when women are given the agency, because I think that there's an understanding that historically women have been denied some of the economic opportunities that men have had access to, specifically white women and white men. But I think what's interesting is that there's more research coming out about the more agency that women have with their money, then the equality can really be there, and also they can outpace men in some ways. So I'll give two examples. So on average, a woman who runs her own investing portfolio outperforms a man who runs his own investing portfolio. Comparing the two, the women, a female portfolio tends to outperform a male portfolio. And so that's a good example of, like, you have two types of people who are making their own investing decisions. It's completely up to them. They have the freedom to make their own choices. And there's economic equality that we see there. And it's similar with credit card debt. Women have less credit card debt than men. There are, of course, systemic issues that give rise to consequences and circumstances where credit card debt might be more common. But in general, you have a good amount of control over at least how much credit card debt you can pay off. And women have less credit card debt than men. So two worlds in which you have a lot of freedom, both with your credit card debt and your investments. And in those places, women can really shine. But when we look at the opportunities for in finance, where it's a part of a larger system, like the wage gap is a good example. Women make 16% less than men on average. And that is certainly systemic. It's not like women are writing their own offer letters and are saying, you know what, I think I should make 84 cents on the dollar compared to a man. Like, I will give myself that job offer. But they're within this system where the freedom to make that choice is not theirs. And so that is where they start to fall behind. And it's similar with investment. Female-founded companies get 2% of VC funding, and male-founded companies get 98% of VC funding. And that is systemic too. That is a choice that they are not making for themselves. And so in seeing these patterns, that when women have the freedom to make their own choices, that's when the economic equality can really start to play out in real time. Trying to figure out what our role is in providing agency and access to women has been how we've been thinking about how to create our podcasts. But then with the question of people of color and new Americans, I'm neither of those things. But both are issues that I care about deeply. And so we had to think about, how do we be good allies? And I think the two ways that we don't have everything figured out, but the two ways that we've tried to approach that is by saying, first, we have a microphone, let's pass it to people in those communities instead of assuming that we know the best way to talk about these issues. And then also, to not making assumptions around the type of financial literacy information that those communities need, and instead just asking. And so what we do as formats of Money Rehab specifically is we invite listeners to come on the show and ask questions. So instead of saying, like, I think this community needs to know more about this topic, we just say, come on the show and ask a question, and we'll just listen and provide whatever information you ask for.
When you say pass the mic to somebody, you mean somebody else who hosts the podcast, or you mean, so you said you invite people on?
Yeah.
But it's interesting, but you actually, you give people, a lot of women and people of color and others, like a lot of agency, right? Because you actually let them run the show.
Yeah. So we do both. So of the seven podcasts that we have, many of them are hosted by either a woman or a person of color. The show that I mentioned, that's hosted by a Cuban woman, Nelly Galan, who ran Telemundo for a while. It's the only personal finance podcast that publishes episodes in both English and in Spanish. And so providing equal access to that information for that community, which the Hispanic community was hit particularly hard economically during COVID. And so that was providing a Spanish language podcast was really important to us. And so, yeah, literally passing the mic to people who can tell their own stories, both in the capacity as a host and running their own show, or as a guest who can come on anonymously and ask their financial question and have expert advice from somebody who is, certified to talk about it.
And how did it come about, this, the whole group of people, new Americans? Because I find that's fascinating. And how do you find them, and who are they, and how do you define that And what do they need to know?
Yeah, well, the way that we think about that has also been really driven by the audience that we have and the questions that we get asked. And that's another place where we've had to really confront our own blind spots, just because we have done a lot of episodes, for example, on credit score and credit history, but people who are new to the US don't have a credit score. So we had been talking about how to improve your credit score, but if you don't have one, addressing the question starting from how do you start to build a credit score for the first time as an adult who's new to this country, we got that question specifically from a listener, and it made us think, oh, we weren't actually thinking about somebody who was living that experience, and so we should make sure to provide resources for that person too.
So one of your titles is editor-in-chief.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big title. What does it mean? And what does that mean that you do day to day? Like I'm going to ask you too, so you can think about it in the back of your head. Like, I always love the dilemmas that you come up with a person. Like anybody in a leadership position always has things which you get thrown at you and you got to figure out. And so first, tell us about what it means to be an editor-in-chief. What do you do? What is the job? And second of all, what are the sticky issues that you've worked your way through that you've failed at or succeeded at or happy about or sad about or would change?
Yeah. Great question. So as editor-in-chief, I oversee our slate of the 7 podcasts. And also, as we continue to build it, I'm looking at what new opportunities we have to create new conversations in new shows. We're not going to stop at 7. We'll do more shows, and so thinking about our collection of shows as a whole and where we have gaps and where we can fill those and how to fill those is part of my job. I'm also the producer of all of the podcasts, and so I do topic selection with the hosts. I book a lot of the guests. I do some of the audio editing. So from a really sort of big zoomed out perspective, I do a lot of the work on sort of our mission as a brand is to close as much as we can, or at least narrow the wealth gap for women and people of color. So always sort of laddering back to that mission and how are the shows that we're creating supporting that mission as a whole. But then also really sort of finite, like I was just working on an episode of Money Rehab where we had a recovering gambling addict come on the show and talk about his experience and what it was like to be a compulsive gambler, and then also in the fallout of his recovery, how he's rebuilding his credit score and his retirement savings and things like that. And so as an editor, listening to that specific episode and making sure that the way that we're representing him is fair and that he is getting the information that he needs out of the segment, and being really careful about the language. And so on both sort of a broad sense and a really narrow sense, I'm looking at the content that we're creating and making sure that it's, we say that our network is hoping to make change in every sense of the word. And so we want to be a viable business, and we want to do a business that does good and does well also, like does financially well, but it also does good.
Do you, as editor-in-chief who's thinking about content, what are the issues that you grapple with? Do you think, is there anything that you're like, oh no, we wouldn't touch that 10-foot pole? Like that's too, because we all know we live in a very divisive world these days. And that's the job of an editor-in-chief, to actually think, okay, well, this is important for us to do. So can you think of an issue, like what would be an issue that come up with that related to money and financial literacy that that you like to attack, or you wish that you had, or wish you'd done differently?
That issue comes up the most for us in advertising. So being really selective about the advertisers that we decide to work with, just because people come to us and listen to our shows in order to get financial advice. And there's a lot of trust that we have with our audience. And so being really selective about the partners that we work with. And that's one of the reasons why too, we decided to start our own network, just because we all remember last year when there was the big crypto FTX crumble. If we had been asked to read an FTX ad when the show was still at a larger network, we wouldn't have been able to say no. And so that didn't happen, thankfully, but we started to think about what we would do in a situation where something like that happened, where we were being asked to recommend a financial tool that we didn't believe was in the best interest of the audience. And so making sure that we have the integrity to make those decisions ourselves was really important to starting the network. But we've been approached by sports betting apps about advertising on our show, and they've offered us a lot of money, and we've said no, even though we're a startup and money would be very nice to have. But people are trusting us to give them financial advice, and if we direct them towards a sports gambling app, that completely goes against our mission. And so making sure that we're choosing partners that are really actually a good fit for our audience, I would say that's the most complicated and the most difficult thing that I have to deal with.
What do you know about the 6.2 million viewers on are they mostly women? Are they mostly people of color? Is it a mix?
It's 75% women. I don't have demographics on sort of the cultural background or race or anything like that. But we know that 75% women in the 25 to 45 age range. And it's the interesting thing about the audience is it really is a wide range of people. There are people who work on Wall Street and work at an investment firm, but just want to do more with their money. And there are people who are, in their 50s and haven't started saving for retirement yet, and are like, oh, really got to get on that. And everyone in between. And so it's one of the fun things about having guests on the show is that people have all different types of money stories and backgrounds and ideas about not just what they should be doing with their money, but what a rich life looks like for them. And it's very interesting to hear those stories. But it is a female skewing audience. But after that, everyone's pretty different. Yeah.
The podcast world is very crowded. Is that intimidating to you and to your Money News network?
No, I'm gonna say no, because what I've been seeing is that you're totally right. The podcast world is very saturated, and I was seeing it. They were grappling with it more at iHeart because iHeart's model was very much like take the biggest celebrity that you can find and then have them host their own podcast and hope that their audience listens to it. But that has become a very tired format. And so audiences now, what I'm seeing, are seeking more intentional formats of the shows and are not just looking at shows that big celebrities are coming on and thinking people will listen to me because I have a big audience and I'm a big name, and so people will find what I have to say interesting. We're seeing that listeners want their podcasts to work a little bit harder for them and be more intentional about the format and the people that they have, and not just bank on the power of celebrity to make a conversation interesting. And so I would perhaps be more nervous if we didn't have such an intentional niche network. But because we're so focused on financial literacy, I think that audiences are looking for more specific types of content now than just the broad, like spray and pray kind of strategy of podcasting even a couple of years ago.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll open it up to all of you who can fill in the blanks of what I haven't been able to ask or haven't thought to ask. That would be great. The question I want to ask is, as a woman, I love questions like this. I think, like, I find it fascinating. You came from this small island, small community. You arrived with a suitcase, in New York City, and you took it on. It seems like you're very comfortable there now. I might just add that you wouldn't be able to tell, but Morgan arrived this morning at 3 a.m. at Bangor Airport on a delayed flight because her co-founder was on Good Morning America yesterday. I think it was yesterday, and Morgan flew down to be there too. So she really is in the thick of it. But could you just reflect a little bit about being, I'm going to say it, being a woman from a small town, and basically you've taken on this big city. Tell us what's that about and what your reflections are, and how you feel about it.
Yeah, that's a very thoughtful question. When I was working at iHeart, my boss at the time, who is so smart, his name's John, I would love to sort of peek over his shoulder when he was editing the promo scripts for broadcast radio ads and promoting iHeart's concerts and things like that, because I just love to see the edits that he would make and the decisions that he would make. And he would always say, the person that's listening to this promo probably is not a person in a cab in New York City. It's probably somebody listening from a small town, because there's just more of that in the US than there are the big cities. And so I felt like that actually positioned me well to think like a lot of people who are listening to the radio, who are listening to podcasts, they are listening from a small town, and it's not just New York, and it's not just LA and these other media hubs. And so I think that being able to think like a listener has really helped me make content that resonates. But yeah, I think just in the spirit of reflecting, it's very special to be here in this place and to be able to talk about it, because this is a community that I love so much. And like you said, everybody showed up in the rain to come and talk together today. That's so special. Nobody would do that in New York. And so I'm very grateful for this community and to be from this community. And I think that there are so many good stories in Maine, and there are so many good storytellers that I think that just being a part of this community has definitely helped the way that I think about telling stories.
Is it hard being a woman in the podcast universe? I don't know like how it stacks up. Is it mostly men who work in management positions there or founding positions, or is it women, or I don't know how you're a minority or a majority?
Yeah, at iHeart, there was definitely there was both an age and a gender ceiling that you sort of bumped up against. And so that was another reason why I left too. I had sort of I was 27 when I left iHeart. And so there was a point where they were like, we can't promote you to this title because you're 27. But I felt that sort of the challenges and the assumptions of being a woman a little bit more actually when I was in the science track. I would be in classes, and there were fewer women in the neuroscience classes than men, but some people outside of the Skidmore community, when we would go and volunteer at like a school science fair day, would ask my male counterparts like, oh, neuroscience, are you going to be a doctor? And then to me, they'd be like, oh, neuroscience, are you going to be a nurse? And so I felt that more in the sciences, but less so in media, honestly. I think that that there's been in the sort of wake and critical thinking of the Me Too movement. I think that there's been a lot of critical thinking around how women are treated in entertainment, and I think that I've benefited from those conversations. But I think that the actual stories that we're telling, and for us specifically in this world of finance, I think that is where the challenge comes a little bit more, and breaking down the barriers in the specifically finance world as opposed to the media world is where it's more challenging, but it's really rewarding.
Thank you. So I wanted to open it up. Sean has a mic, which he'll go around. I see Tony standing in the back.
All right, Tony.
And then we'll try to get in as many questions as we can. Sean's going to help me make sure, but Tony, go ahead.
Congratulations. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Congratulations, Morgan.
Thanks,
It's
Tony.
pretty amazing.
Thank you.
And I know how much courage it takes to make that leap at 27.
Thanks.
Two-part question about the business model. I
Yeah.
was actually involved in a business where we did a lot of advertising on iHeartRadio
Mm.
and tried to do podcast advertising, and it always felt like podcasts were too expensive.
Mm.
The model just didn't seem like it had dialed in the right price formula. So curious whether that's something that continues and whether you get that from your advertisers. The second part is there a subscription element to your business model?
Oh, great questions. So the part about podcast advertising being expensive, that is such a phenomenon that so many people are experiencing, and I think it's a byproduct of the fact that there are bigger, not just iHeart, but bigger podcast companies that do have such a range of different types of shows with a different type of audience. And I think for us, one of the ways that we've been strategic is by being really narrow about the types of content that we're creating, so that we can tell a really clear story to advertisers and say, we know that we have listeners who are interested in learning about financial products, and so you make sense to us as an advertiser. But we would, even on the flip side, when we were launching Money Rehab on iHeartRadio, they gave us a certain number of impressions that would run in the ad spots, and they would run in like the middle of the night in a show about, I don't know, music, where it's not going to convert as well for us. And so I think that podcast advertising can be really effective. I think that the role of the podcast network should be to be really transparent about who is going to be listening to your ads and why it actually makes sense to serve that audience your ad, because that's where you can justify the cost. But otherwise, it becomes more difficult. And then we don't have a subscription-based offering. We've grappled with that a little bit, just because it is a model that a lot of other networks are going for and are working really well for them. And we're a startup, and so we're interested in making smart money-making decisions that other networks are. But the trick for us, and where we run into the stickiness, is that we love that we're providing free financial literacy resources. And if we put it behind a paywall, and making people pay to get access to information about how to keep more money just doesn't quite feel right. And so we haven't pursued something like that yet. We're thinking about maybe doing a free membership just to engage with the community a little bit more. But a paid subscription isn't something that we're considering right now. But it does, like, I listen to some true crime podcasts, and I'll pay to listen to episodes in advance. Like, I totally get that the model works for some shows, but just not for ours.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Roland Reynolds, and I just want to say thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Beth. I joined the board of COA about 2.5 years ago, and I never need a reminder of why this place is so special, bringing incredible content, this kind of turnout. So just thank you, thank you, thank you. I wanted to follow up on Tony's question, which is, I'm super interested in the business model as well, and particularly where you have impact and mission. But you do need to make money in the end. These are really always create the sticky situations. And I was really interested, Beth started to tease on a topic that around advertising and around who you take as advertisers. And I wanted to take it one step deeper, which is, if I understand your model correctly, you have a lot of people across the country, not in big cities, that are listening and really need your advice and your content. And that doesn't always lend itself well to those companies that can serve them best. For example, Citibank, Chase, these big banks that do a lot of good and presumably a lot of harm, may or may not, they may be the best advertisers in terms of dollars, but maybe Machias Bank or some other local regional bank might actually have the better solution, the better people who can have the empathy to serve your clients the best. And so I wanted to just tease out how you think about trying to get local advertisers and those who probably aren't coming to you saying, I want to advertise with you, sort of getting the word out about what you're doing and how you can reach the local advertisers who are probably in a better position to, and I might be wrong, maybe it's not the local advertisers. So
No, it's a really great point, and it's a really great question. And we do the short answer is that there are some capabilities to serve a particular ad to a particular location. So the technology is there to work with more local advertisers, and we've done that a little bit in states like California, where where insurance is so complicated. We've done some specific initiatives with local insurance companies to help California better understand that landscape. And I think the way that we've handled it so far is that to me is sort of more of an education question, and educating people that there might be a local resource or a local alternative that's a better fit for them. And so educating people on that through the content rather than the advertising itself. And so we're working right now with Alliant Credit Union. And so we do try to be selective about, this credit union, not for profit. And so like a place like Chase Bank that is, charging a lot in overdraft fees or ATM fees or things like that, and is trying to make money from its customers. And so trying to be really thoughtful about working instead with like the credit unions of the world that have less of emphasis on profit and more of a focus on their consumers. But I would say my answer to that is we've done a lot of episodes around choosing the right bank for you. And because of that, some advertisers don't want to work with us because they want to work with us on an exclusive basis where we won't agree to promote a competitor. And we just can't do that because it's more important for us to keep the integrity of the show and the recommendations that we give out. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nina Dietz. I'm actually an environmental reporter.
Cool.
And I was actually really interested in, you just mentioned insurance, how a lot of people put the majority of their money into their home. And it's now getting to the point where in some places you can't find insurance. How are you looking at helping people navigate, like, how do you ensure this major investment that's for a lot of people, it is their retirement, or
Yeah.
it is most of what they're passing on to their kids? How are you navigating that as things are changing?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I'll start by saying that just that the intersection of sustainability and money in general and sort of the question of like climate related problems will affect people's homes, but also their money in all sorts of other ways. And something that we've been also helping educate people on is that a lot of people's 401ks are invested in oil, like their companies can make that decision for them. And so people might not know that they're investing in things that are hurting the environment. And so educating people about that has been something that, and there are so many funds that you can invest in that don't include oil in them and things like that. And there are so many other options. But the best that it's also such a complicated issue because the picture looks so different, whether you live in California where you might not even be able to get insurance right now, or Florida where you might not be able to get insurance right now. And just pointing people towards the place where they can find the specific resource for them, but also helping people. We have a couple of different sort of flow charts that we've provided past episodes about how to decide if owning a home is right for you, because there are some people that are listening in major cities where the cost of home ownership is so high, and the opportunity cost of putting a down payment for a home versus investing that in the market is a question that people should sort of grapple with themselves on an individual case-by-case basis. And so it's a really good question. We should probably do another episode on it. I think that's a great idea. But doing the best that we can to help people make the decision that's going to be right for them, and the type of, if they are thinking about what they want to pass on to their kids, how to make that decision for them, rather than having one of our hosts just tell them exactly what to do, because so few of these questions are one size fits all in the end.
Hi, Morgan.
Hello.
Congratulations. I'm so
Thank you.
proud of you.
Thank you. So nice.
I have a question about, you give financial advice. Are you a financial advisor?
So I don't give financial advice, thankfully, but our hosts do. And so our host, Nicole Lappin, she's a certified financial planner.
Okay, because that's what I was wondering. If somebody calls and they're there, should I be in an IRA? Should I be in a REIT? Should I be in a SEP? Should I be this and that? So you do have a host who is advising these people who call in and ask these questions.
Yes.
Now, do you have a host that is well-rounded and knows all these answers, or do you have different people at different times talk about different things?
It's a great question. And one of the great things about our hosts is that while they do have all of the alphabet soup of the CFP and all of their certifications, they also know what they don't know. And especially Nicole, who was on CNBC and Bloomberg and CNN, she has this amazing Rolodex. And so when someone submits a question that's really specific about a REIT or about a particular type of retirement account, and Nicole feels like she can't give the right answer, she'll call someone else up and have them come on the show too, to give their perspective and make sure that it's a trusted person who can give that advice.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Hi. First, I just wanted to say thank you. I think this has been a lot of really wonderful information.
Okay.
I'm a first generation college student who comes from a really low income background, and listening to you talking about this sort of like people of color and women and new Americans, I also am like have a sense, for me at least, in that category of like first generation college students, and that like facing paying off all of these loans without any generational knowledge, and that sort of like heavy disadvantage of not feeling the ability to sort of like get rid of that burden in an easy way, and feeling like that, like my parents, I'm 20 and my parents are still paying off their 30-year mortgage, you know? So facing that, like, I'm wondering what resources your podcast does offer or may offer in the future for students in that position of like facing that long-term debt and not feeling like they have the resources that other peers may have to find ways to pay that off.
Yeah, it's such a common and important question, and thank you for sharing that. Student debt is one of the most frequently asked questions that we get about on the show, because it is so daunting, and people at all stages in the process, like when they're deciding whether or not to go to college and knowing that they're going to sign up for debt, or they're in the process of graduating and paying off their debt, and we've been lucky in that we have been doing this for a while, and so we have now been able to make connections with, Senator Warren invited us to come to Washington to talk about student debt, and to ask questions about what student debt legislation might look like in the years coming and after the election, and what will happen with the election, and things like that. And so getting another part that we talked about earlier about like the importance of passing the microphone is that Nicole has had such a long career and has really built all of these interesting connections, and being able to use them to ask questions for people who, like, when I was in college, I couldn't have asked Senator Warren anything. But being able to sort of pass along the questions that she's getting from her audience. But in terms of what resources we offer, we have a lot of episodes about, like, for example, seeing what type of repayment plans you're eligible for based on how much income you're earning, if you're earning income, and things like that. And also just like, especially during COVID, all of the like student loans are paused, now they're unpaused, now they're thawing, now they're frozen again, and all of the back and forth, just trying to provide the most updated information. But in terms of resources, we have our hosts speak either from their own experience or research, or have another expert come on and talk to them on the show about actually walking someone through the process of what options do they have for paying off student debt in a way, in a financial plan that doesn't feel so burdensome, and that you also have the ability to, like, you work so hard for your money, like being able to also use it for things that feel rewarding to you, and not just feeling like it's this snowball of debt that you're always working through. But Money Rehab is great, a lot of great resources.
In-
Thank you. One of the phrases you used really resonated with me, and that was what a rich life looks to them. Does the podcast get into discussing want versus need or prioritization?
Yes, definitely. That is something that we've talked about a lot on the show, and also the importance of, if you're in or interested in being a long-term partnership, also talking to your partner about what that looks like early on, because finding out, on the eve of your retirement, that you wanted to retire in a big mansion in Italy, and your partner actually wanted to be in Bar Harbor, Maine, who wouldn't want to retire here. Having those conversations early so that you can make sure that you're on track, because these decisions with our money compound, and it's something that you hear a lot in this space is, it's not timing the market, but it's time in the market. And the longer that you're there, the better your money and the harder your money can work for you. But yeah, the way that we actually get pretty technical with it. One of our hosts, Nicole, who I've mentioned a couple of times, has done a few episodes on truly like walking somebody who's listening through, write down how much you're spending now. Do you want to be spending more or less in retirement? If you think you're going to be if you're going to want to spend as much as you're spending now in retirement, multiply that by how many years you think you're going to be in retirement based on when you want to retire. That's how much money you're going to need in order to live your rich life. So let's figure out how you get there. But really having people go through the exercise of figuring out what that life looks like for them and then putting an actual price tag on it so that people can know what they're working towards has been really important, and helping people come up with an actual plan that can get them there. But it all starts with coming up with those numbers. Yeah.
Great. Why don't we take just one more and then we'll wrap it up?
Just a quick question. How did you and your business partner connect?
Oh, great question. So the way that iHeart works is sort of like a newsroom where you just get assigned a particular show. And so I was assigned to a show with Nicole that became Money Rehab. So she was a host that came to iHeart pitching a show during COVID. She had written, she's on the 4th book of her 7-book deal. They've all been New York Times best-selling books. She's very impressive. But so people come to her with questions, and during COVID, she was getting a lot of questions about financial hardship. And so that's why she wanted to start this show, Money Rehab. And so I got assigned to her show completely at random. And when I talked to her for the first time, she was writing her most recent book that came out a year or two ago. And we had our first Zoom call and we talked about the show, and she talked about what she wanted to do. And she was writing a book. She had gotten this Airbnb in the middle of the desert, and there were all of these like wild hogs running around her. And I was like, you're very interesting. And I'd like to do more work with you. But we've gotten to be very close. She's a really great mentor, and we work really well together. And she just got married, and I spoke at her wedding. And so it's been really great to work really well with someone, also be able to have a friendship with them and feel like a mentorship too. And yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
So I think we're going to call it.
Yeah.
We're going to call it a day, right?
I think so.
Morgan, thank you very much for bringing some sunshine to. Otherwise, thank you.
And also thank you, Beth. I think we all probably feel like next time I should interview you, because we all want to hear about your art history. It's so cool.
We could do that. One thing I wanted to say as we close, I had this nice flash, because I was also a young woman working in TV news, in my case in TV news for NBC News and on Dateline. And when I was young, in my early 20s, there was a young star coming through NBC who was named Katie Couric. And I kind of watched her. She's a little bit older than I am, but I watched her kind of do that. And I would kind of hear these snippets, and something that Morgan said resonated with me, because someone told me one time, you know, Beth, when Katie Couric was at CNN, she always finished anything she did, and she turned to the person next to her and said, how can I do that better? I know there's a better way to do that. How can I do that? And I, like, as a young woman and being so vulnerable, obviously, and we're all I always thought that was like amazing. I was like, that kind of empowered me. Like, you could actually show your vulnerability and say, I know I can do better. And Morgan saying that she was leaning over her iMedia boss's shoulder to see how he was editing things. And I was like, I was like, she has a little bit of Katie Couric in her. So anyway, but thank you everybody for coming, and great to see you again. I guess we're not going to be here next week, because we hope to see you at Summer Institute.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Morgan. That was really, really, really wonderful and interesting. And yes, next week, Summer Institute. So come join us, everyone, and pray that we just have good weather. Small things. All right, everybody. Thanks.